There is a particular kind of power that never appears on a ballot. It doesn't campaign. It doesn't shake hands at county fairs or make promises on television. It doesn't need your vote because it was never designed to ask for one. And in the entire sweep of American history, no single person embodied that kind of power more completely, more quietly, or more dangerously than a man named John Edgar Hoover. Here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How does someone who was never elected to anything become one of the most feared and influential figures in the most powerful government on earth? Not for a term, not for a decade, for nearly 50 years, through 8 presidents, through 2 world wars, through the Great Depression, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and Vietnam, through every seismic shift in American life from 1924 until the morning of May 2nd, 1972, when he died at his desk and the country exhaled a breath it had been holding for half a century. J. Edgar Hoover ran the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's the official answer, but that answer barely scratches the surface of what he actually did, what he actually knew, and what he was actually capable of. Because Hoover didn't just run a law enforcement agency. He built one from almost nothing, shaped it in his own image, and then used it as a lever to move the entire architecture of American political life. He collected secrets. He traded in fear. He understood earlier and more clearly than almost anyone around him that information is power and that the person who holds the files holds the room. What makes his story so strange, so worth examining slowly and carefully, is that it isn't the story of a tyrant who seized power by force. There was no coup, no revolution, no moment of dramatic overthrow. Hoover accumulated his influence the way water shapes stone. Gradually, persistently, through patience, through bureaucratic precision, through an almost surgical understanding of what elected officials were afraid of and how to make himself indispensable to them. He was appointed by one attorney general and kept by every administration that followed, because getting rid of him was always more dangerous than keeping him. The story of J. Edgar Hoover is a biography, yes, but it is also something larger than one man's life. It is a study in how institutions shape themselves around the people who build them. It is a window into the relationship between secrecy and democratic government, between national security and civil liberties, between the fear that drives a country to demand protection and the machinery that grows up to provide it. And it is a reminder that some of the most consequential decisions in American history were never made in open session, never debated on the floor of Congress, never put to any public vote at all. They were made in offices most Americans didn't know existed, by a man most Americans thought they understood but didn't. Over the next several hours, we are going to follow Hoover from his beginnings in Washington, through the Red Scares and gangster wars, and communist panics that gave him his ammunition, through the long middle years when his power seemed unassailable, and into the final decade when the country he had helped shape began to ask uncomfortable questions about what exactly had been done in its name. We'll look at the files he kept and the people he destroyed. We'll look at the movements he surveilled and the presidents he quietly controlled. We'll look at what COINTELPRO actually was, what it actually did to real human beings, and why it took so long for most Americans to find out. This is a story about fear, the fear that swept America in the aftermath of revolution abroad and unrest at home, the fear of communism, of crime, of subversion, of change. Hoover was a brilliant reader of national anxiety, and he knew how to position himself as the solution. Every crisis that unsettled the country became an argument for more resources, more authority, more reach. And every expansion of his power made the next expansion easier to justify. So get comfortable. Let the room settle around you. This is a long story, and it rewards patience, because the most important things Hoover did, he did quietly, in the background, over years and decades. And that is exactly how he intended it. We begin where he began, in Washington at the turn of the 20th century, in a city that was still figuring out what kind of country it wanted to be, and a young man who had already decided exactly what he wanted to become. John Edgar Hoover was born on January 1, 1895, in Washington, D.C. Not in New York, not in the great churning cities of the industrial Midwest, but in the federal city itself. The city of government, the city of departments and bureaus and clerks and procedure. He came into the world about 12 blocks from the Capitol building, in a neighborhood called Seward Square, in a household that revolved around order, routine, and respectability. His father, Dickerson Hoover, was a government employee. His mother, Annie, was the dominant presence in the home, a woman of firm moral convictions and high expectations who shaped her youngest son with a kind of quiet intensity that never left him. The Hoovers were middle class in the specific Washington way, which meant their status was tied not to wealth but to position, to the sense that they belonged to the machinery of the federal government, and that the federal government was a serious and dignified thing. Edgar, as the family called him, absorbed that worldview early and kept it for the rest of his life. He was a slight, intense child. He stuttered as a boy, which drove him to speak in short, controlled bursts, to think before he opened his mouth, to compensate for the stumble in his speech with an almost aggressive precision of thought. He joined the debating team at Central High School and drilled himself until the stutter was largely managed, until he could project confidence and authority. He graduated as valedictorian. He was the kind of student who didn't just do the work but organized it, labeled it, kept it. Even then, there was something in him that needed to impose order on whatever was in front of him. He enrolled at George Washington University to study law, taking night classes while working during the day to help support the family after his father's mental health deteriorated and Dickerson was eventually institutionalized. This is worth pausing on. Hoover grew up watching a man who had been a reliable, respectable government worker come undone, lose his grip on the ordered life he had built, and disappear into an institution. It is difficult to know how much that shaped the armor that Hoover spent the rest of his life constructing around himself, the absolute refusal to show weakness, the obsessive control over his own image and environment, the terror of disorder in any form. But it would be strange if it shaped nothing. His first real job was at the Library of Congress, where he worked as a cataloger. He was 19. The Library of Congress in those years was engaged in an enormous systematic effort to organize the accumulated knowledge of a civilization, to take the vast disordered sprawl of books and documents and impose upon them a rational, searchable structure. Hoover was very good at this, not just competent, but genuinely suited to it in some deep way. He understood the logic of classification. He understood that the value of information depended entirely on your ability to find it again. He filed, he indexed, he cross-referenced, he built systems that held. In 1917, he moved to the Justice Department. He was 22 years old, freshly admitted to the bar, and the federal government was expanding rapidly as the United States entered the First World War. The Justice Department was hiring. There was work to be done, mostly administrative, mostly the kind of work that required exactly the skills Hoover had spent the last several years developing. He knew how to manage files. He knew how to move paper through a bureaucracy. He knew how to make himself useful in an institution that ran on procedure. And he was in Washington at exactly the right moment. The federal government of the early 20th century was growing in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the founders. The progressive era had expanded the idea of what government could and should do. New agencies, new departments, new regulatory bodies were appearing and multiplying. The country was becoming more complex, more interconnected, more urban, and the machinery of the federal state was growing to match it. For a young man who believed deeply in the rightness of order, who had been trained by temperament and circumstance to see systematic organization as a kind of moral virtue, this was a landscape full of possibility. There was also something in Hoover that fit the particular culture of Washington in a way that the culture of other American cities would not have suited him. He never married. He lived with his mother until her death in 1938, and then he lived alone in the same neighborhood for the rest of his life. He didn't drink, at least not in the early years. He didn't gamble. He dressed carefully, maintained his weight, kept his office spotless. His personal life was as organized and controlled as his professional one. Washington, a city of institutions and protocols and men in suits, who valued process over personality, suited him perfectly. By the time he was in his mid-20s, working his way up the ranks of the Justice Department, Hoover had already developed the habits that would define his career. He kept notes. He maintained records. He paid attention to detail in the way that most people paid attention to broad strokes, the small discrepancies, the things people let slip, the pattern underneath the surface. He understood instinctively that knowledge had leverage, that the person who knew the most about a situation was rarely the least powerful person in the room. He hadn't yet built anything. He hadn't yet become anyone that most Americans would recognize. But the tools were already in his hands, He just needed a crisis large enough to use them on. And as it happened, America was about to provide exactly that. The crisis arrived in the form of a revolution that happened on the other side of the world and terrified an entire hemisphere. In 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian government and announced to anyone paying attention that their ambitions were not confined to Russia. The international communist movement believed that capitalism was a global system and that its replacement would have to be global too. They said so openly. And in the United States, a country already wound tight with wartime anxiety, already suspicious of immigrants and radicals, and anyone who questioned the order of things, the Russian Revolution landed like a lit match in a dry field. The anxiety had been building for years before the revolution confirmed it. Labor strikes were spreading, anarchist groups were active. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, were organizing in ways that made industrialists and politicians genuinely nervous. The war had heightened everything, compressed every tension, made every dissident voice feel more dangerous than it might have in quieter times. When the war ended in 1918, the anxiety didn't dissolve. It concentrated. In 1919, bombs started appearing. A mail bomb was sent to the mayor of Seattle, another to a senator. Packages addressed to 36 public figures, including John D. Rockefeller and Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. In June of that year, bombs exploded simultaneously in 8 cities. One of them went off on the front porch of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's home in Washington. Palmer himself was unhurt, but he was not unchanged. He had already been thinking about radicals. Now he was thinking about them with the focused intensity of a man who had nearly been killed by one. Palmer wanted action, the Justice Department wanted action. And a 24-year-old lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover was right there, ready to provide it. Palmer appointed Hoover to head the newly created Radical Division within the Bureau of Investigation, which would later be renamed the General Intelligence Division. The job was to track, catalog, and ultimately neutralize the radical threat to American society. It was, in retrospect, a perfect match of man and mission. Hoover attacked it with the same systematic energy he had brought to the card catalogs of the Library of Congress, except now the cards held names, not books. Within months, Hoover had compiled a filing index of nearly 200,000 individuals and organizations he considered radical or potentially dangerous. He cross-referenced them by name, association, political affiliation, and activity. He built a machinery of surveillance that allowed the division to track correspondence, monitor meetings, infiltrate organizations with informants, and accumulate detail on people who had not been charged with any crime and in many cases had not committed one. The system was meticulous. It was also deeply troubling, though almost no one was troubled by it yet. Then came the Palmer raids. In November of 1919 and January of 1920, the Justice Department carried out the largest mass arrests in American history to that point. Federal agents and local police swept into homes, meeting halls, union offices, and immigrant communities across the country. In a single night in January, raids were conducted simultaneously in 33 cities. Somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people were arrested. Many were held without charges. Many were denied access to lawyers. Many were immigrants, and the goal in those cases was not criminal prosecution but deportation, the permanent removal of the undesirable from American soil. Hoover coordinated the administrative machinery behind the raids with the same obsessive precision he brought to everything. He prepared the arrest warrants, organized the filing systems, managed the paperwork that moved thousands of people through the detention process. The logistics were staggering, and he handled them well. He also helped build the legal framework that justified the arrests, which was thin at best and in many cases non-existent. People were arrested not for acts they had committed, but for beliefs they held or organizations they had joined. Emma Goldman was deported. A ship carrying 249 deportees, many of them anarchists and labor organizers, sailed from New York Harbor to the Soviet Union in December of 1919. The newspapers called it the Soviet Ark. Hoover reportedly stood on the dock and watched it leave. But almost immediately, the backlash began. Louis Post, the Assistant Secretary of Labor, started reviewing the deportation cases that landed on his desk and found them deeply flawed. Procedural violations everywhere. People arrested without warrants, held without charges, denied counsel. He canceled more than 2,000 of the deportation orders. Palmer tried to have him fired. Instead, Post went before Congress and methodically dismantled the legal case for what the Justice Department had done. 12 of the most prominent lawyers in the country, including future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, published a report cataloging the violations of due process, the coerced confessions, the illegal searches, the detention of people who had done nothing more than hold unpopular political opinions. The report was damning. It described a government that had used the machinery of law enforcement as an instrument of political repression. And then Palmer's own credibility collapsed. He had been predicting a massive radical uprising for months, a coordinated attack on the government scheduled for May 1, 1920. The date came and went without incident. The uprising never materialized. Palmer looked either paranoid or dishonest, possibly both. His presidential ambitions faded. The Red Scare began to deflate. But Hoover watched all of this and drew his own conclusions, which were not quite the same as the public's conclusions. The public concluded that the raids had been an overreach, a moment of hysteria that had damaged innocent people and embarrassed the government. Hoover concluded that the raids had been poorly executed, that the legal frameworks had been too flimsy, and that the fundamental project, identifying and tracking and neutralizing political dissent, was correct even if the specific methods had invited trouble. He filed that lesson away carefully. The goal was not to abandon surveillance. The goal was to build surveillance that couldn't be challenged the same way. What the first Red Scare gave Hoover was not just experience. It gave him something harder to measure, and more important, a first real taste of national power. He had coordinated a federal operation that touched 33 cities in a single night. His filing systems had indexed hundreds of thousands of names. His division had shaped the domestic security policy of the United States government. He was 24, then 25, then still quite young, and he had already done things that most men in Washington careers 3 times as long would never do. He had also made enemies and attracted critics, but he had noticed something about critics. You could outlast them if you kept your files in order. The men who attacked their raids moved on to other things. Hoover stayed at his desk, kept his records, and waited for the next opportunity to make himself indispensable. He wouldn't have to wait long. The opportunity came from a different kind of crisis, one that did not explode but rotted quietly. By the early 1920s, the Bureau of Investigation, the Justice Department's small federal detective force, was not an organization that inspired confidence. It was a patchwork of patronage hires, local toughs, political loyalists, and a few serious investigators trying to do work inside a system that did not always reward seriousness. Standards were loose, oversight was thin. The lines between law enforcement, politics, and private favors were blurry on a good day. Then the scandals started to surface. The Harding administration was already drowning in corruption stories, the most famous being Teapot Dome, in which federal oil reserves were handed over to private interests under suspiciously friendly terms. The Bureau of Investigation was pulled into this larger orbit of scandal. Agents were accused of abusing their powers, of spying on political opponents for partisan reasons, of doing private investigative work for friends of the administration. Some had side deals with bootleggers, in an era when enforcing prohibition could be a very profitable business if you enforced it selectively. The Bureau's director, William J. Burns, was a famous private detective before he took the job. He brought with him a showman's instinct and a flexible attitude toward rules that might get in the way of outcomes. That style worked in the world of Pinkerton operatives and strikebreaking. It looked different inside a federal agency that was supposed to enforce the law impartially. Burns cultivated press attention, promised results, but left behind a trail of questionable methods and political entanglements. As congressional investigations peeled back layers of the Harding-era scandals, the Bureau's reputation sank with the rest. By 1924, the political cost was too high. The new Attorney General, Harlan Fiske Stone, a conservative but also a lawyer's lawyer, looked at the Bureau and saw a liability. He wanted something that resembled a neutral professional investigative service, not a private police force for whichever party occupied the White House. Burns had to go. The Bureau needed a new director. It needed someone who looked clean, efficient, and boring in the best possible way. Hoover was right where he always tried to be, at the intersection of ambition and necessity. Stone had watched Hoover in the Justice Department. He knew about the radical division, the files, the system building. He also knew that Hoover's name had not been splashed across the Teapot Dome headlines. For all his enthusiasm for surveillance, Hoover had stayed mostly behind the scenes. He looked like a technocrat, not a politician. In an era of scandal, that was a kind of purity. In May 1924, Stone appointed J. Edgar Hoover as acting director of the Bureau of Investigation. A few months later, the acting part disappeared. The young man who had once been indexing immigrant radicals in card catalogs was now in charge of the entire Federal Investigative Service. Hoover understood immediately that his first job was not catching criminals. It was cleansing the institution. He moved fast. He ordered all agents to submit detailed personal histories. He fired those with serious corruption allegations or criminal records. He pushed out men he considered incompetent, unreliable, or too entangled with local political machines. Hiring through patronage networks was quietly strangled. Hoover wanted a corps of agents who owed their positions to centralized approval, not to some senator's recommendation letter. He imposed rules, so many rules. Agents were required to keep meticulous time records, detailed case files, standardized reports. Expenses had to be justified, travel had to be cleared. He banned the use of third-degree methods, at least on paper. He prohibited agents from talking to the press without authorization. He tightened dress codes, insisted on neatness, on a particular physical presentation that matched his idea of seriousness. The Bureau would not only be clean, it would look clean. Professionalization was his watchword. He began insisting that agents have legal or accounting training, that they be college-educated when possible, that they be able to navigate courtrooms and financial records as easily as they navigated streets. This was not always perfectly enforced, but the aspiration mattered. It made the Bureau seem different from the stereotypical roughneck lawman. It suggested expertise instead of brute force. At the core of all this was something Hoover had always valued more than almost anything else: records. He centralized them. Case files, fingerprint cards, personal histories, investigative reports, photographs, everything flowed toward Washington. He expanded the fingerprint division into a national repository. Local police departments began sending prints to the Bureau. Courts did too. Over time, the Bureau became the default national archive of criminal identity in the United States. If you wanted to know whether a suspect in Chicago had a record in St. Louis, you asked Hoover's Bureau. This was sold as modernization, and in many ways it was. It was also power. Whoever controlled the records controlled the flow of information. Whoever decided what went into the files decided what the government would remember. Merit standards helped Hoover twice. Outwardly, they gave him something to point to when critics questioned the Bureau's past. The old patronage hires were gone, he could say. The new agents were professionals. Internally, merit, defined by examinations, evaluations, and loyalty to Bureau procedures, gave Hoover a tool to reward obedience and punish resistance. Promotions, assignments, and job security all ran through a system he wrote. He cultivated the Bureau's public image at the same time he was rewriting its internal rules. He downplayed the scandals, emphasized reform, and allowed carefully managed stories about the new standards to drift into newspapers. The picture that emerged was of a modern, scientific investigative body run by a man who disdained politics and loved order. It was not a complete picture, but it was reassuring to a political class eager to put the heart and years behind it. The paradox of Hoover's reforms is that they made him look less political while making him personally harder to dislodge. The more he could argue that the Bureau was a professional institution, governed by rules rather than whim, the more disruptive it would seem to replace him. New attorneys general and new presidents came and went. They inherited not just an office with a director, but an entire system whose logic pointed back to that director. The files, the training standards, the disciplinary codes, the centralized records, all of it bore his imprint. If the Bureau was modern, it was modern in his image. If it was efficient along channels he had carved. If it was indispensable, then so, quietly, was he. What began as an institutional cleanup, a necessary response to scandal, evolved into something else. It became the foundation of a personal empire built inside a bureaucracy, an empire that grew stronger with every record filed, every agent trained to a standard he defined, every case that required the Bureau's unique combination of national reach and centralized memory. Hoover had taken a tarnished agency and made it respectable. He had also taken a fragile position and made it central. The Bureau was being rebuilt, so was his power. Hoover's next move was to take his cleaned-up core of agents and convince the country that they weren't just honest, but modern. At a time when much of American policing still looked like something out of the 19th century, local sheriffs relying on informants, beat cops walking the same routes, small-town detectives trading gossip, Hoover began talking about scientific crime fighting. It was a phrase that sounded reassuringly neutral. It suggested method, rigor, and technology instead of politics and brute force. He had an opening because the tools really were changing. Fingerprinting had been used in the United States before Hoover, but it wasn't centralized. Big cities ran their own files. States kept their own records. A set of prints taken in Kansas might sit in a drawer in Topeka, while a man with the same fingers was arrested years later in New Jersey and treated like a first-time offender. Identity was local, fragmented, and easy to escape if you were willing to move or change your name. Hoover wanted something else. He wanted a single national index, something that sat in Washington and answered questions from everywhere. He expanded the Bureau's fingerprint division massively. He pushed hard for local police departments, state prisons, and courts to send in their fingerprint cards. The pitch was simple: send us your records, and in return you get access to everyone else's. Over time, envelopes and packets of inked cards poured in from across the country. Clerks indexed them, cross-referenced them, and stored them in cabinets that filled room after room. The result was a kind of memory that no local force could match. A burglary suspect in Alabama could be tied to an unsolved robbery in Ohio because both sets of prints went through the same federal files. A drifter arrested under one name could be unmasked as a repeat offender under another because the Bureau's fingerprint index did not care what name he wrote on the booking form. Selling this as a public service was easy. Police chiefs liked having somewhere to turn that could answer questions about a stranger's past. Judges liked knowing whether they were sentencing a first offender or a career criminal. Legislators liked the sound of national coordination in an era anxious about crime and mobility. But what looked like a shared resource was also a lever of control. If everyone's records flowed to Washington, then Washington became the indispensable clearinghouse. And inside Washington, it was Hoover's Bureau that decided how those records were kept, who had access, and what categories of information counted as important. The same logic shaped the development of the FBI's laboratory. In the 1920s, forensic science in the United States was a patchwork. A few big city departments had their own ballistics experts or chemists. Some prosecutors hired private specialists. Many cases still relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, confessions, and circumstantial evidence shaped by local habits and prejudices. Hoover wanted the Bureau to sit at the center of a different system, one where physical evidence and technical analysis gave his agents a special authority. In 1932, the Bureau formally established its own crime laboratory in Washington. It began modestly: ballistics comparison, handwriting analysis, some chemical tests. But the idea was ambitious. Local police could send bullets, shell casings, forged checks, ransom notes, fibers, and unknown powders to Washington. The Bureau's experts would analyze them and return neat, typed reports. Again, the pitch sounded simple. We have expertise you don't. Let us help. For small-town departments, this was a revolution. They suddenly had access to advanced tools without having to build expensive labs of their own. For prosecutors, FBI lab reports looked impressive in court. They bore the seal of the federal government and the aura of science. Juries listened. With each case, the Bureau's scientific reputation grew. Newspapers began to mention G-men with microscopes and comparison microscopes that could match bullets to guns. The narrative shifted from rough chases and shootouts to careful analysis, from the image of the tough local cop to the image of the trained federal expert. Hoover leaned into that image with training. He believed that if the Bureau was going to claim technical superiority, its agents had to be schooled in a way that local police usually were not. He formalized training programs, first informally, and then through what became the FBI Academy. New agents spent weeks learning Bureau procedures, evidence handling, interrogation rules, and the basics of law and forensic science. They learned how to write reports in the approved style, how to testify in court, how to present themselves as calm professionals rather than improvising toughs. Later, Hoover opened versions of this training to selected local and state officers. That generosity was strategic. Teaching local police the Bureau's methods created allies on the ground and quietly spread Hoover's standards outward. A sheriff who had been to a Bureau course was more likely to respect Hoover's rules, send his fingerprints to Washington, and think of the FBI as the natural leader in any serious case. Beneath the talk of science and education was a simple pattern: centralization through expertise. The same thing was happening with communications technology. In the early 20th century, a sheriff's jurisdiction really did stop at the county line, not just legally but practically. If a suspect fled across a state border, word traveled slowly by letter, by phone call if someone had the number, by chance meetings between officers at conferences or on cases. Criminals could exploit that slowness. Hoover's bureau began stitching those gaps together with wires and radios. He standardized telegraphic and later teletype communications, creating formats for urgent bulletins and circulars that could be sent quickly across the country. A bank robbery in one city could produce a nationwide description within hours, not days. The Bureau cultivated direct lines to major departments, bypassing some of the ad hoc personal networks that had previously governed information sharing. As radio technology matured, the Bureau encouraged coordinated use of radios in cars and offices, pushing for common practices that made it easier to broadcast alerts and coordinate multi-jurisdictional manhunts. In strategic cases, FBI offices could act as hubs, relaying information among local departments that were not yet wired to talk directly to each other. On paper, this was a simple story of modernization: faster communication, better coordination, less room for criminals to slip through cracks between jurisdictions. In practice, it also meant that more and more serious investigations passed through channels the Bureau controlled or strongly influenced. Hoover liked that. The old tradition of the proud local sheriff, beholden mostly to county voters and state laws, looked messy to him. It depended on personalities, on local politics, on uneven capacities. Some sheriffs were diligent, others corrupt or overwhelmed. Their authority was deep but narrow. The model Hoover built was shallower but much wider. No single FBI agent could rival a small-town sheriff's personal knowledge of a community, but the Bureau as a whole could reach across states, compare cases, and pull patterns out of data. It could deploy expertise, records, and communications networks that no single locality could match. Local policing traditions placed power in many hands, each anchored to a community. Hoover's centralized model gathered the strings in one place. Local departments still made arrests, still patrolled streets, but they increasingly did so with reference to federal files, federal lab results, and federal bulletins. That shift brought prestige. The Bureau's association with science and national coordination made it attractive to ambitious young lawyers and college graduates who might once have avoided police work as rough or parochial. It gave members of Congress and presidents something to point to when they wanted to show that the federal government was serious about crime. Headlines about fingerprint matches and lab breakthroughs made the FBI look like the cutting edge of modern justice. Prestige, in turn, hardened Hoover's position. When critics questioned the Bureau, they were not just challenging one man, they seemed to be questioning the very idea of scientific law enforcement, of national coordination, of modernity itself. Hoover had successfully fused his personal administration with the identity of the institution. Every new file in a cabinet, every bullet mailed to the lab, every young officer trained at a Bureau school deepened that fusion. The tools were modern, but the structure they reinforced was very old. A single director whose reach extended wherever the records, the radios, and the rules could go. The timing of all this modernization turned out to be perfect for Hoover, because the country was about to become obsessed with crime. The early 1930s were a bad time to be poor and a good time to be a headline writer. The Great Depression shattered banks, farms, and families. Millions were out of work. People lost homes to foreclosure, savings to bank failures, and faith in institutions that seemed either powerless or indifferent. Against that background, stories of daring criminals cutting across state lines with fast cars and machine guns landed with a strange mix of fear and fascination. Newspapers and radio stations leaned into it. They needed attention. Stories about a man who robbed a bank in Illinois, shot his way through a police cordon in Indiana, and vanished into the next state gave them drama and movement. Names like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, the Barker Carpus Gang, Machine Gun Kelly, they sounded like characters from Pulp Fiction, but they were very real, and they made local police look slow and outmatched. At the same time, law and politics were changing. For most of American history, serious crime was seen as a local or state problem. The federal government had limited criminal jurisdiction. Bank robbery, kidnapping, interstate flight, many of the offenses that made headlines in the early 1930s were either not clearly federal crimes yet, or were only beginning to be treated that way. As criminals used cars, highways, and state borders to evade local pursuits, the idea of a national police force began to sound less sinister and more like a necessity. Hoover understood the moment. He had already built a bureau that could claim scientific methods and national coordination. Now the country seemed ready for a story about crime fighters who could go anywhere the gangsters went. He began to supply that story with great care. The turning point came with cases that combined genuine danger with showmanship. In 1932, the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's infant son horrified the public. The case led to a new federal law, making interstate kidnapping a federal offense. Hoover's bureau played a role, though not the starring one it would later claim, in the investigation that eventually caught and convicted Bruno Hauptmann. The important thing was perception. The bureau was seen as part of the answer when a crime shocked the entire nation. Soon after, high-profile manhunts made that perception more vivid. Dillinger robbed banks across the Midwest, escaped from jails, slipped past local police, and cultivated his own myth. He became a kind of dark celebrity, photographed, rumored, endlessly written about. It was the sort of notoriety that infuriated politicians and frightened respectable citizens. When Dillinger was finally trapped and killed outside a Chicago theater in 1934, Hoover's G-men were suddenly the counter-myth. Newspapers ran with the phrase short for government men and attached it to clean-cut, suit-wearing federal agents who supposedly combined brains, bravery, and moral purpose. The Bureau's role in the chase for Pretty Boy Floyd that same year, and later in bringing down the Barker Carpus gang, reinforced the narrative. Each case had complex interplays of local cops, chance leads, and brute luck. But by the time the public heard the story, it usually sounded like a tale of tireless federal agents who never gave up and always got their man. That was not an accident, it was Hoover's work. He cultivated relationships with reporters and editors. He made sure that when big cases broke, the Bureau's perspective appeared quickly in print. Official press releases emphasized federal coordination, the role of the lab, the bravery of agents. Details that made local police look foolish or sidelined were smoothed over. Details that highlighted risky raids or scientific sleuthing were polished and repeated. Hoover also learned that images mattered. Publicity photos showed trim, serious men in dark suits examining evidence, standing by seized weapons, or lined up in orderly formation. The contrast with popular images of rough local cops, shirt sleeves rolled up, ties askew, was deliberate. G-men looked like professionals out of a new age, almost like corporate executives of justice. The tension between the real and the polished was always there. Real investigations were messy. Lead after lead went nowhere. Informants lied. Jurisdictional fights with local sheriffs and city detectives were common. Sometimes the Bureau arrived late in the case and benefited from groundwork others had already laid. Sometimes mistakes were made and covered up, but the public rarely saw that side. When raids went wrong or suspects died under ambiguous circumstances, Hoover's office moved quickly to frame events. The Bureau emphasized the danger the agents had faced, the weapons seized, the alleged violent histories of those killed. Questions about tactics or planning were downplayed. The scientific lab, the fingerprints, the nationwide files, these always stood front and center in official accounts, even if a particular arrest had more to do with a lucky tip or a nervous accomplice. Over time, the line between honest reporting and public relations blurred. Hoover wrote articles under his own name for popular magazines, describing the Bureau's work in clear, reassuring language. He published books, or had them ghostwritten, that recounted famous cases in ways that placed the FBI at the center of the nation's defense against crime. Schools and civic groups received educational materials portraying the Bureau as the model of modern law enforcement. The effect was cumulative. What had begun as an administrative job running a federal investigative office slowly turned Hoover himself into a symbol. His name appeared in headlines, his image in magazines, his pronouncements quoted as authoritative. Parents wrote letters asking for signed photographs for their children. Young men fantasized about becoming G-men rather than cowboys or soldiers. With fame came something even more useful to Hoover: political capital. Members of Congress heard from constituents who admired the FBI. They read glowing stories about daring raids and efficient laboratories. In hearings, Hoover presented himself as the calm, apolitical expert who simply wanted better tools to fight dangerous criminals who crossed state lines. When he asked for expanded jurisdictions, more agents, or a larger budget, it was hard for legislators to say no without seeming soft on crime. Presidents noticed the same thing. Franklin Roosevelt, facing the combined pressures of economic crisis and rising global tensions, appreciated having a popular, competent-seeming national police chief he did not have to micromanage. Hoover's public image made him hard to replace and useful to keep. A president could point to the FBI as proof that the federal government was energetic and effective, which was exactly the message the New Deal coalition wanted to send. Hoover understood that his celebrity was not just personal vanity. It was insurance. So long as the public believed in the myth of the incorruptible G-man and saw Hoover as the architect of that myth, his position was safer. Criticism of the Bureau could be dismissed as the complaints of criminals, radicals, or jealous local officials. Congressional oversight grew timid. Presidents hesitated to challenge him directly. The crime wave of the 1930s slowly receded. Some gangsters died in shootouts. Others went to prison. Laws tightened. The front-page robberies and kidnappings became less frequent, but the image forged in those hectic years remained. The FBI was now in the public mind, not just a government office, but a national shield. And J. Edgar Hoover was no longer just a bureaucrat behind a desk. He was the face attached to that shield, a symbol of order and control in an anxious age, ready to be carried with him into the far wider struggles that were coming. By the mid-1930s, Hoover had something he'd never had before: a president who needed him. Franklin Roosevelt had come into office promising bold, persistent experimentation. The New Deal meant new agencies, new regulations, and new expectations that Washington would solve problems that had once been left to local governments or private charity. It also meant anxiety. Business leaders feared socialism. The conservative press warned about dictatorship. On the other side, the unemployed marched, unions organized, and radical parties criticized the whole economic system. The country was not just in an economic crisis, it was in an argument about what America should be. Hoover watched all of this from his office and saw opportunity. He had built a bureau that looked efficient, scientific, and clean at a time when many state and local systems looked corrupt or overwhelmed. Roosevelt, for his part, wanted to show that the federal government could act decisively without becoming openly repressive. A disciplined national police force, run by a man who sold himself as apolitical and law-bound, was a useful tool. The relationship between the two men was not warm in any personal sense. Hoover was suspicious of much of the New Deal. Roosevelt enjoyed power and improvisation in ways that made Hoover uneasy. But they understood each other's value. The turning point came as Roosevelt began to worry less about bank robbers and more about subversives. The 1930s were a decade of intense ideological conflict worldwide. Fascism rose in Germany, Italy, and Spain. Communism, centered in the Soviet Union, offered its own model of revolution. In the United States, these currents flowed into existing frustrations. Communists organized among the unemployed and in some unions. Fascist-leaning groups courted veterans and nativists. There were homegrown demagogues on the radio, peddling anti-Semitism, anti-bank conspiracies, and resentment. To Roosevelt, whose political survival depended on holding together a fragile coalition, these extremes looked dangerous. Hoover had been watching radicals since the first Red Scare after World War I. He never stopped seeing them as the core threat to American order. Now he told the White House that his bureau could track them, map their organizations, and keep them from turning unrest into organized revolt. That was a message Roosevelt was ready to hear. The president began quietly expanding the FBI's mission. Under the cover of national emergency, the line between ordinary criminal investigation and political intelligence started to blur. Official directives allowed Hoover to collect information on anyone suspected of seeking to overthrow the government by force or violence. In practice, that category could stretch. Labor organizers who led sit-down strikes, especially in key industries, attracted attention. Left-wing parties, socialist newspapers, and radical student groups became subjects of files. So did some right-wing organizations that flirted with fascist imagery or foreign ties. The Bureau gathered speeches, pamphlets, membership lists, and rumors, feeding them into card indexes that could be searched at the stroke of a key. Much of this work had no clear basis in statute. Congress had not passed a law saying that the FBI should monitor political beliefs, but Roosevelt's letters, memos, and informal conversations with Hoover created an understanding. The president wanted to be informed. The pattern was simple. Emergencies widened authority. First, the Depression, then the fear of fascism, then the approach of war. Each crisis justified more preventive work. Each time, the FBI's mandate stretched a little further beyond bank robbery and kidnapping, into the realm of ideas and associations. Hoover was careful in how he framed this. In meetings and memos, he emphasized violence, sabotage, and foreign influence. He spoke of fifth columns and subversive activities rather than leftists or union leaders, even when those were his private concerns. The language reassured Roosevelt that the Bureau remained focused on security, not partisan advantage. In reality, the new investigative powers and the expanding New Deal state reinforced each other. As Washington created more programs, more regulations, and more federal spending, it created more potential targets for fraud, corruption, and political protest. The FBI offered itself as the guardian of this new apparatus, rooting out schemes, policing threats, and monitoring groups that might disrupt key sectors. An agency originally tasked with chasing a few categories of criminals now sat near the center of the federal government's nervous system. For Roosevelt, this was useful. He could experiment boldly, knowing that if opposition crossed certain lines, or if it merely looked like it might, Hoover's men were already watching. Reports landed on the president's desk describing radical leaders, their foreign ties, their speeches, their personal weaknesses. It was a stream of intelligence that no previous president had enjoyed on such a scale. For Hoover, the arrangement was even more valuable. Every time the White House leaned on the Bureau for sensitive work, Hoover could remind officials that discretion was part of the bargain. He built a reputation as someone who kept secrets, who did not embarrass presidents, and who quietly handled tasks that might be awkward if traced directly to the Oval Office. Over the years, this created a kind of mutual dependence. Presidents, starting with Roosevelt, found Hoover too useful to offend. Even when civil libertarians and some members of Congress questioned FBI methods, raids on radicals, broad surveillance of labor groups, political dossiers compiled without warrants, the White House tended to look the other way. Roosevelt might gently rein in a proposal here or there, but he rarely challenged the underlying system. He understood, as did his successors, that the same techniques critics disliked could be turned to presidential advantage in times of danger. Hoover understood, meanwhile, that his growing stockpile of information gave him leverage. He knew who visited whom, who financed which causes, which aides had embarrassing secrets. He did not need to threaten anyone openly. The simple fact that his bureau knew so much and answered only loosely to Congress made him hard to dislodge. In Roosevelt's America, the architecture of modern federal power took shape: alphabet agencies, mass programs, and a presidency that expected to steer the economy and the nation through crisis. Folded into that architecture, largely out of public sight, was the FBI. The G-Man image remained on the surface: scientific crime fighters, clean suits, fingerprints, and labs. Underneath, Hoover was weaving the Bureau into the fabric of executive power, turning it into something more than a police force, a standing intelligence arm of the presidency, born in emergency, normalized by habit, and ready to expand again when the next crisis arrived. The next crisis arrived, as Hoover had always suspected it would, from abroad. In the late 1930s, as war spread across Europe and Asia, the question in Washington was not if the United States would be drawn in, but when and how. Franklin Roosevelt worried about spies, saboteurs, and secret networks that might soften the country up before a formal declaration of war. Hoover stepped forward with a familiar promise: the Bureau could watch the home front. On paper, responsibility for foreign intelligence belonged mostly to the State Department, the Army, and the Navy. Hoover had no legal claim to run espionage abroad, so he focused on what he could frame as his natural domain: enemies inside American borders. He began with German agents. The First World War had left a memory of sabotage plots and propaganda campaigns, some exaggerated, some real. Hoover studied those files and saw a template. In the years just before Pearl Harbor, the FBI expanded its surveillance of German consulates, businesses with German links, and organizations thought to be sympathetic to Berlin. Informants were recruited in shipping companies, chemical plants, and communities with large numbers of recent immigrants. Italian and Japanese nationals, and citizens with roots in those countries, soon joined the list of people to watch. The Bureau compiled indexes of dangerous aliens and suspected sympathizers. These lists were not based on trials or convictions. They were built from newspaper clippings, anonymous tips, past political activity, and the judgments of agents who knew that Hoover expected them to err on the side of suspicion. When war finally came in December 1941, Hoover was ready. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the FBI began arresting hundreds of German, Italian, and Japanese nationals who had appeared in its files. These were described as enemy aliens, potential saboteurs and spies. Some had long ties to fascist groups, or had been in suspicious contact with foreign officials. Others had simply attracted attention through association, rumor, or past activism. The war gave the Bureau, and Hoover personally, something he had long wanted: a clear, immediate justification for preventive action. Congress passed broad laws criminalizing sabotage, espionage, and assistance to the enemy. Executive orders empowered the government to control communications, seize property, and restrict movement. The president and military authorities issued directives that stressed speed over procedure. In this atmosphere, the difference between investigating a crime and detaining someone because they might commit one soon became hard to see. Nowhere was this more visible than in the treatment of Japanese Americans. The mass removal and incarceration of more than 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast was formally a military decision, justified by claims of security and the risk of hidden enemy networks. But the FBI had been collecting information on Japanese communities for years. Its reports, however incomplete or biased, helped create the atmosphere of fear in which such a sweeping policy could seem reasonable to many officials. Hoover was not the main architect of internment, and at times he quietly questioned the Army's broad approach. He preferred targeted arrests and controlled surveillance to wholesale roundups that drew public controversy. But the system that put entire families behind barbed wire depended on the same logic the Bureau had been using: that ancestry, association, and geography could stand in for individual proof of guilt. War gave that logic official sanction. Inside the country, the Bureau's reach extended far beyond foreign nationals. Labor disputes in defense industries, anti-war activists, isolationist groups, and even some mainstream organizations that criticized Roosevelt's policies found themselves under closer watch. Agents attended meetings. They pulled trash from office bins. They listened at doors and asked quiet questions of landlords and neighbors. Many of these investigations never led to charges. They were not meant to. Their purpose was to map networks, identify leaders, and prepare for the possibility that ordinary dissent might, under pressure, become sabotage or sedition. The boundaries between opinion, association, and conspiracy blurred. Secrecy made it easier. The war effort depended on censorship and information control. The government restricted what could be published about troop movements, ship sinkings, and new weapons. Much of the FBI's work slid under the same cover. Court cases that might have exposed investigative methods were often handled in ways that kept evidence vague. National security was invoked to shield sources and techniques from scrutiny. Inside the Bureau, Hoover encouraged a culture in which the normal safeguards of criminal procedure were treated as peacetime luxuries. Wiretaps and microphone placements, already common in political investigations, expanded under wartime urgency. Some had formal authorization. Others relied on the same kinds of loosely worded presidential directives that Hoover had used in the 1930s. If agents believed a contact was connected with the enemy, the usual hesitations about warrants and admissibility tended to fall away. Legal lines that had once been firm now looked like suggestions. The Supreme Court upheld broad theories of presidential and military power. Congress pumped money into security agencies with few detailed conditions. Editors and civic groups that might have objected worried about being labeled unpatriotic. In that environment, Hoover could experiment with forms of surveillance that would have been politically difficult a decade earlier. The war also changed how Americans thought about intelligence. Successes, some real and some carefully advertised, made the FBI look indispensable. Highly publicized espionage cases, like the disruption of German spy rings early in the war, reinforced a narrative that Hoover carefully fed, that the Bureau's quiet work had prevented devastating acts of sabotage. Each foiled plot, whether uncovered through painstaking detective work or luck, became a lesson in the value of constant vigilance. Hoover capitalized on this mood. He reminded the White House that the enemy had not only armies and fleets but fifth columns, hidden supporters who might be activated at any moment. He described the Bureau as the only agency with the experience, files, and discipline to track such dangers inside the United States. Regular reports to Roosevelt and his advisors emphasized both the threats discovered and the vastness of the unseen landscape still to be explored. War poured concrete around the foundations Hoover had been laying since the first Red Scare. The idea that the federal government should maintain a permanent internal security apparatus no longer seemed extraordinary. It seemed prudent. Citizens grew used to loyalty checks, background investigations, and the notion that some organizations would be quietly watched for years without ever being charged with a crime. When peace finally came in 1945, much of this machinery did not disappear. The files remained. The informant networks in factories, unions, and ethnic communities remained. The habits of broad surveillance, of stretching legal authority in the name of invisible dangers, remained. New threats could easily be plugged into the old frameworks. Hoover emerged from the war with more than just a stronger bureau. He had a proven narrative that in times of emergency, giving the FBI wide, secret powers had kept the nation safe. He would use that story, and the structures built under its cover, as the United States shifted almost seamlessly from global war to a new and more shadowy conflict, the Cold War, where the line between foreign enemy and domestic suspect would grow even thinner. The Cold War gave Hoover something he had never quite possessed before, a permanent emergency that never officially ended. In the late 1940s, as relations with the Soviet Union collapsed into suspicion and rivalry, old fears of radicalism returned in a new vocabulary. Communism was no longer just a domestic ideology to be watched during strikes and protests. It was a global movement backed by a hostile nuclear power. To Hoover, this was confirmation, not surprise. He had spent his life warning that subversives were patient, organized, and waiting for the right moment. Now, the right moment seemed to have arrived. The Truman administration worried about spies in government and sabotage in key industries. Hoover replied that the Bureau already had the tools to respond: loyalty checks, background investigations, and the massive war-era files that had never been dismantled. The first big step was the Federal Loyalty Program. In 1947, President Truman issued an executive order requiring loyalty screening for all federal employees. Anyone whose loyalty was questioned could be investigated and, in some cases, removed. The language was broad. It mentioned sabotage, espionage, and violent revolution, but also sympathetic association with subversive groups. It did not define exactly what that meant. Hoover helped fill in the blanks. The FBI took the lead in background checks, using the wartime habit of preventive investigation as a model. Agents combed through personnel records, union membership lists, political donations, and old campus groups. They read letters to the editor, tracked attendance at meetings, and interviewed neighbors, colleagues, and former classmates. They consulted the Bureau's growing index of organizations labeled subversive, a list compiled internally with little outside review. A rumor could start a file could trigger an investigation. An investigation could quietly end a career. Most loyalty cases never reached a courtroom. Many did not even result in formal charges. The system was designed to be administrative, not judicial. Standards of evidence were looser than in criminal trials, and secrecy was the default. Anonymous informants and unverifiable allegations could be weighed heavily. For Hoover, this was a feature, not a bug. It allowed the Bureau to act on what he liked to call intelligence rather than waiting for proof that would satisfy a jury. The loyalty program also entrenched a particular view of political life. Past membership in left-wing groups, even legal ones, could mark someone as suspect. Signing a petition, speaking at a rally, or subscribing to a radical newspaper might appear years later in an FBI summary. The line between criminal conspiracy and unpopular opinion became more a matter of classification than of law. Hoover positioned himself as the nation's chief interpreter of that line. He produced reports for the White House and cabinet officials that described communist strategy in sweeping terms. Communists, he argued, infiltrated unions, civil rights groups, student organizations, churches, and even religious charities. He stressed that their public language might be moderate and patriotic, but that their real goal was revolution. Once that framework was accepted, almost any independent movement could be cast as a potential front. Congress listened. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, committees like the House Un-American Activities Committee, and later, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee became regular stages for televised hearings about communist influence. Hoover was not always the star witness. He preferred to send senior aides and carefully prepared memos. But the questions those committees asked, and the witnesses they chose to call, were often shaped by FBI files. The Bureau provided background dossiers, suggested lines of inquiry, and quietly flagged which targets were most promising. Friendly members of Congress were briefed in private. Those who publicly supported Hoover's vision of an internal communist menace often received a steady drip of confidential information that helped their political careers. In return, they defended the Bureau's budget, authority, and reputation. This symbiosis extended beyond hearings. Hoover cultivated key senators and representatives with personal letters, holiday greetings, and early access to sensational cases. He invited them to view seized documents, recorded confessions, and charts of alleged communist networks. Many came away convinced that the threat was even greater than what they could safely say in public. That conviction made them protective of the man who claimed to be holding the line. Fear of communism gave Hoover leverage over the broader political culture. In newspapers and on radio, he was quoted as an expert on subversion. He wrote articles and books warning about hidden communist tactics, often blending real espionage cases with conjectural scenarios of what might happen if vigilance relaxed. Civic groups invited him to speak or circulated his pamphlets. School boards approved curricula that echoed his talking points about loyalty, obedience, and the dangers of radical ideas. Under these conditions, criticizing Hoover could look like more than a disagreement about policy. It could be framed as softness on communism. Journalists who asked pointed questions risked losing access to leaks and background briefings. Publishers who considered investigative series received quiet visits from FBI officials reminding them of the Bureau's role in fighting Soviet spies. Politicians who called for stricter oversight could be portrayed, sometimes indirectly, as naive or irresponsible in the face of a cunning enemy. Many understood that Hoover possessed extensive files not only on communists, but on public figures across the spectrum. Those files contained rumors about personal lives, financial troubles, and private remarks made in what people assumed were safe spaces. They drew from informants in hotel staff, secretarial pools, and local police departments. The mere knowledge that such records existed and that Hoover was willing to use them selectively made colleagues and critics cautious. The ideology of anti-communism helped translate emergency tools into permanent structures. Wartime wiretaps became peacetime counterintelligence measures. Temporary loyalty reviews evolved into routine background checks for not just federal employees, but defense contractors, scientists, and eventually many other professions. The Bureau's Internal Security Division grew, formalized, and justified its existence by pointing not to active plots, but to the possibility that plots might be taking shape in silence. Legislation passed in the name of security, laws on registration of subversive groups, restrictions on immigration, and broader definitions of conspiracy created new hooks for investigation. Even when courts later narrowed some of these statutes, the investigative machinery they had enabled remained. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had given Hoover what the First Red Scare and the Second World War had only previewed: a long-term, open-ended mandate. The Soviet Union would not surrender. Communism, as an ideology, would not sign an armistice. That meant the internal front that Hoover described could, in theory, never be fully secured. Every calm period could be treated as a lull before the next wave of infiltration. In that atmosphere, questioning the scope of the FBI's domestic intelligence work was easily recast as questioning whether one truly grasped the danger. Hoover did not need formal emergency decrees to keep expanding his reach. The culture of fear, the bipartisan consensus about the Soviet threat, and the dense web of loyalty programs and investigative files together gave him something more durable, a presumption that whatever he was doing behind closed doors was, by definition, a necessary part of national defense. That presumption would shape not only the careers the Bureau ended in silence, but also the public debates it steered, muted, or never allowed to begin. By the early 1950s, the FBI's power wasn't just in the number of agents it had, or the size of its budget. It was in what it knew and in what people thought it might know. Hoover understood this better than anyone. From his earliest days at the Justice Department, he had believed in files. Index cards, cross-references, clippings, confidential reports, bits of paper that, once gathered and sorted, could be turned into leverage. The Cold War gave him a reason to collect more of them, on more people, and to keep them indefinitely. Officially, the Bureau kept investigative files on crimes and on national security threats. Unofficially, an entire shadow archive grew alongside them. There were files labeled personal and confidential, kept in special safes and accessible only to Hoover and a few trusted aides. They contained photographs, hotel records, intercepted conversations, gossip about affairs, hints of drinking problems, rumors of bribes, and private letters that had been copied before they reached their destination. Many were never used in court. They weren't meant for court. They were meant for conversations. Hoover cultivated a culture inside the Bureau where information flowed up, not out. Field offices sent in summaries of anything that might be of interest involving public figures, judges, journalists, business leaders, celebrities, and especially politicians. A stray comment at a dinner, an argument overheard at a convention, a whisper from a local police chief. It all went into the system. Some of it was routine. Some of it was trash, but buried in the mass of paper were details that could be quietly useful. Washington learned this over time. Members of Congress would receive discreet visits from senior FBI officials. A concern might be raised about one of their aides, or about a political opponent. Sometimes the message was vague. There are matters in this individual's background that could prove embarrassing if they were to come to light. Sometimes a few specifics were hinted at. Rarely was the whole file shown. The point was never spelled out, but it did not need to be. The Bureau had information. It could share it or not. It could help or not. Presidents discovered that Hoover played a similar game at a higher level. Harry Truman distrusted secret police of any kind. He compared the idea of a domestic security service to the Gestapo and worried about what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands. He suspected that Hoover's taste for political intelligence went beyond what was necessary for national security. But Truman also knew that Hoover had files on cabinet members, donors, and even on the White House itself. The Bureau handled background checks, security clearances, and sensitive investigations. It could leak, or it could protect. Truman chose caution. He complained in private, but he kept Hoover. Dwight Eisenhower, the former general, approached Hoover with the discipline of a military commander who had inherited a powerful but independent subordinate. Eisenhower's administration used the Bureau's reports on communist infiltration and internal security, and in return, Hoover was left in place. When staff suggested he should be forced into retirement, cooler heads advised against it. No one wanted a public confrontation with a man who might have a dossier on nearly every figure in government. John F. Kennedy had more reason than most to be wary. The Bureau investigated organized crime at the same time Kennedy's father had long-standing associations with figures in business and politics who were not always careful about the company they kept. The president's private life, with affairs that crossed lines of discretion and security, was an open secret in parts of Washington. Hoover knew the details. He kept tabs on them. Kennedy's brother Robert, as Attorney General, technically outranked Hoover. In theory, he could have imposed reforms, demanded greater transparency, reshaped the Bureau. In practice, the relationship became a tense coexistence. Robert Kennedy pushed the FBI harder on civil rights enforcement, and Hoover resented it. Hoover, in turn, made sure the Kennedys understood that the Bureau's files contained material that, if exposed, would be devastating. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson clung to Hoover as a source of continuity and as an informal political radar. Johnson, a man of backroom deals and whispered information, appreciated what Hoover could offer. The FBI director briefed him on civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers, foreign diplomats, and members of Congress. Johnson sometimes called Hoover late at night to ask who was talking to whom, who might be leaking to the press, who looked vulnerable in an upcoming election. The conversations were often framed as national security, and sometimes they were. But they also drifted into the territory of personal weakness and political opportunity. Hoover did not need to threaten Johnson. The service he provided, constant secret awareness of the private lives of others, was its own form of power. Over time, rumors about what Hoover had in his files outpaced the reality. People imagined thick folders on every senator, tape recordings of every private phone call, photographs from every compromising moment. The truth was more uneven. Some files were thin, some were outdated, some were based on hearsay that would have collapsed under scrutiny. The accuracy almost didn't matter. What mattered was that no one could be sure what Hoover did or did not have. He rarely produced the most explosive material in public. Instead, he let the possibility hang in the air. Presidents, judges, and party leaders learned to ask themselves a quiet question before crossing him. What if he has something on me? That question did as much work as any explicit threat. It explained why Truman complained, but did not remove him. Why Eisenhower tolerated him. Why the Kennedys fought with him in policy but not in tenure. Why Johnson, who pushed many powerful men aside, never quite did so with Hoover. Accommodation seemed safer than confrontation. As long as Hoover controlled the flow of information, what was gathered, what was summarized, what was leaked, and what was buried, he did not need a ballot box or a campaign. He had something more enduring in mid-century Washington, the power to define what others knew about each other and to leave them wondering what he knew about them. By the late 1950s, a different kind of movement was rising in America, one that did not fit neatly into Hoover's familiar categories of gangsters, spies, and subversives. Young people were sitting at lunch counters, riding buses, marching without weapons. Black ministers were quoting the Constitution and the Bible, asking the government to enforce its own laws. Television cameras were bringing scenes of dogs, fire hoses, and mob violence into living rooms. For many Americans, the civil rights movement was a demand that the country live up to its stated ideals. For J. Edgar Hoover, it looked like a threat. Hoover had grown up in a segregated Washington, D.C., and never questioned that order. He believed in law and order as he understood it, a hierarchy of institutions and traditions, with federal authority at the top and protests at the bottom. Street demonstrations, boycotts, and acts of civil disobedience looked to him less like democratic participation and more like incipient disorder. He also believed, with a rigidity that bordered on obsession, that communism lurked behind almost every form of dissent. In Hoover's mind, legitimate grievances could be acknowledged perhaps, but organized protest against the status quo almost always suggested foreign influence. Segregation and racial violence were, to him, internal matters. Organized campaigns to challenge them, especially if they embarrassed the United States on the world stage, were suspicious. Martin Luther King Jr. became the focus of that suspicion. At first, King appeared in bureau reports as the young pastor leading the Montgomery bus boycott. His language was religious, his tactics were nonviolent, his appeals were rooted in American law. But as his reputation grew, and as he began meeting with Northern liberals, labor leaders, and international figures, Hoover's attention sharpened. The turning point came when the Bureau learned that one of King's early advisors, Stanley Levison, had a past connection to the Communist Party. To Hoover, that was enough. The fact that Levison had distanced himself from the party years earlier, that his work with King was focused on fundraising and strategy, did not matter. In the logic of the Bureau's internal memos, one such connection could taint an entire movement. Hoover framed it this way to the White House and the Justice Department: communists were attempting to infiltrate and manipulate the civil rights movement. King, whether wittingly or not, was under their influence. Therefore, monitoring him was a matter of national security, not just domestic politics. Once that argument was accepted, the machinery turned on. With authorization from Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, granted under heavy pressure and framed as narrow and temporary, the FBI began wiretapping King's phones and bugging his hotel rooms. Microphones were hidden in lamps and walls. Phone lines were tapped in Atlanta, in New York, in Washington, and in cities where King traveled. Agents followed him, tracked his schedule, copied his correspondence. Informants were cultivated around him, some sympathetic to his cause, others resentful or opportunistic. Reports began to pile up, not about espionage or foreign directives, but about King's private life, his conversations with friends, his disagreements with colleagues, his relationships with women. Hoover had asked to investigate King as a possible security risk. What the Bureau built instead was a detailed portrait of a man's intimate life, kept in secret files, far from any courtroom. The Bureau's focus shifted accordingly. Internal memos show that by the early 1960s, Hoover and his senior aides no longer pretended that they were on the verge of uncovering a communist plot directing King. They had no evidence that he was a party member, no proof that Moscow or Beijing were issuing him instructions. What they had was material they believed could be used to embarrass him, and a growing conviction inside the FBI that King was personally unworthy and politically dangerous. Hoover came to see King as a liar and a hypocrite. He resented the praise King received from the press, from churches, from universities. He bristled when King criticized the FBI's record on civil rights, especially its reluctance to confront violence in the South. When King publicly questioned the Bureau's commitment to protecting black citizens, Hoover replied by calling him the most notorious liar in the country. The surveillance deepened. Agents compiled summaries of King's movements, listed the names of people he met, cataloged rumors and gossip. Tapes of his hotel room activities were transcribed, copied, and distributed inside a small circle at headquarters. None of this was about solving crimes. It was about building a dossier that could be used to discredit him if Hoover chose. Eventually, the Bureau took a more active step. Using the wiretap recordings, the FBI assembled an anonymous package, a selection of audio tapes and a letter. The letter, written in a taunting, accusatory tone, implied that King's private conduct would soon be exposed, that he had betrayed his followers, and that there was only one way out that would preserve his reputation. It stopped short of spelling the word, but its meaning was unmistakable. It urged him to kill himself. The package was mailed to King's home. Coretta Scott King opened it first. This was not an act of law enforcement. It was not a search for truth in a criminal case. It was an attempt by a federal agency, directed by its longtime leader, to psychologically pressure a private citizen into silence, or worse, because his public work threatened entrenched systems of power. The justification remained the same in Bureau paperwork: national security, communist influence, subversion. The reality was closer to something older and simpler, using the tools of the state against a movement demanding equal citizenship. The constitutional implications were stark. The First Amendment guarantees the right to speak, to assemble, to petition the government for a redress of grievances. King's campaigns were exactly that: organized petitions, marches, sermons, and negotiations aimed at changing unjust laws. The FBI's response: warranted and unwarranted surveillance, attempts at blackmail, secret efforts to fracture his marriage, quiet contacts with journalists and local officials to spread derogatory information, cut directly against those protections. The Bureau did not charge King with a crime. It did not bring evidence into open court, where it could be tested. Instead, it created a parallel system of judgment, hidden inside Hoover's files, where allegations could be gathered and deployed without the safeguards of due process. Hoover's hostility toward King also revealed something about the internal logic of his worldview. Anti-communism, which had once been aimed at spies and party organizers, became a flexible label that could be attached to almost any challenge to existing hierarchies. If a movement criticized segregation, it might be communist-inspired. If it attacked economic inequality, it might be communist-influenced. If it drew international attention to American hypocrisy, it might be serving communist propaganda. This logic allowed the Bureau to treat democratic reform as a kind of threat equivalent to foreign subversion. It also connected the civil rights surveillance to a broader pattern. The same Bureau that tracked John Lennon's anti-war songs, infiltrated student groups, and opened files on journalists and professors used the language of security to justify monitoring a Baptist minister who preached nonviolence. In each case, the line between protecting the nation and protecting the existing order blurred. The King episode brought the darker side of Hoover's system into particular focus because history did not cooperate with the Bureau's suspicions. The civil rights movement did not become a communist front. It did not lead to violent revolution. It led instead to landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, incremental but real changes rooted in the kind of democratic process the Constitution envisioned. Against that backdrop, the FBI's secret campaign looks less like caution and more like abuse. When the details began to emerge years later, through investigations and declassified documents, they reshaped Hoover's image. The heroic crime fighter of popular myth appeared alongside the man who had tried to destroy one of the most respected moral leaders in American history. In the records of microphones and memos, a simple truth becomes hard to ignore. When one unelected official controlled vast secret powers, and when fear of ideological enemies justified almost any method, the line between guarding democracy and undermining it could quietly disappear. By the time the campaign against King was underway, Hoover had already built a broader framework for dealing with anyone he regarded as a threat. Inside the Bureau, it had a bureaucratic name, COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. On paper, counterintelligence meant identifying and neutralizing foreign spies, saboteurs, and covert influence operations. In practice, under Hoover, COINTELPRO expanded into something much larger, a secret system for managing dissent inside the United States. It began in 1956 with a focus on the Communist Party USA. Hoover had been chasing communists since the Palmer raids. By the mid-1950s, the domestic party was small, divided, deeply infiltrated, and losing influence. The danger it posed was arguable. The opportunity it presented was not. COINTELPRO was designed as a permanent, organized way to do what Hoover's bureau had done informally for years: infiltrate, disrupt, and discredit groups he disliked, without waiting for crimes to occur, and without going through courts. Over time, new programs were added beneath the same umbrella. There was COINTELPRO White Hate, aimed at the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations. COINTELPRO Black Nationalist Hate Groups, aimed at Black Panthers, SNCC militants, Malcolm X's followers, and others. COINTELPRO New Left, focused on student movements, anti-war activists, women's liberation groups, and radical intellectuals. Even some Puerto Rican independence organizations, socialist parties, and certain religious communities found themselves listed in the files. The targets ranged across the political spectrum, from right-wing segregationists to left-wing radicals. That diversity later allowed defenders to claim the Bureau had been even-handed. The common factor was not ideology, it was challenge. Any group that seemed capable of mobilizing people, reshaping public debate, or weakening confidence in established institutions could be drawn into Hoover's net. The methods the Bureau used were different from normal law enforcement. In a criminal investigation, agents are supposed to gather evidence that a law has been broken, present it to prosecutors, and if charges are filed, allow a court to decide guilt or innocence. Surveillance is a tool to build a case. The goal is to stop specific illegal acts and then step back. COINTELPRO reversed that logic. The goal was not to gather proof of crimes already committed. It was to prevent movements from gaining strength by sowing distrust, paralysis, and collapse from within. The files use a particular word again and again: disruption. Disruption meant many things. Agents wrote anonymous letters to activist spouses, hinting at affairs and infidelity, hoping to break up marriages and partnerships. They forged letters on organizational letterhead, sending fake messages between rival leaders to spark arguments, splits, and expulsions. They planted rumors in local communities that certain organizers were government informants, knowing that in some groups, that label could lead to physical danger or death. They encouraged disputes over money, over ideology, over personal behavior, feeding the natural tensions of any human group. Informants were directed not only to report on meetings, but to steer them. They were told to push for more extreme positions, to advocate violence in organizations that had been nonviolent, to propose unwise actions that would invite police crackdowns. They helped create the conditions for the very extremism the Bureau then used to justify more surveillance. For Black organizations, the tactics could be especially brutal. The FBI sent forged letters between leaders of rival groups, inflaming personal and political conflicts. In the case of the Black Panther Party, COINTELPRO memos explicitly called for actions to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unite Black militants, a category in which they listed Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, and others. The Bureau distributed anonymous cartoons mocking Panther leaders, mailed fake threats supposedly from one faction to another, and cooperated quietly with local police raids. It celebrated when internal disputes turned into deadly confrontations, recording in files when successful operations had led to splits, arrests, or killings. Student and anti-war groups were treated with a similar mixture of surveillance and manipulation. Informants joined campus organizations, helped draft manifestos, and then reported the names of everyone who raised a hand in support. Anonymous letters went to university administrators painting activists as violent, unstable, or foreign-controlled. Employers and draft boards sometimes received quiet visits or phone calls. The line between observing political activity and shaping it blurred until it effectively disappeared. Hoover insisted that COINTELPRO was a defensive measure, aimed at preventing violence and infiltration by hostile powers. But the internal documents tell a different story. They speak of preventing speakers from appearing on campuses, blocking people from getting jobs, limiting the ability of groups to organize legal demonstrations, undermining public support for lawful causes by spreading disinformation. The Bureau was not just watching the political landscape, it was reaching into it with invisible hands, rearranging alliances, nudging movements toward failure. All of this operated under a heavy cloak of secrecy. COINTELPRO was not publicly debated in Congress. It was not authorized by specific legislation. Most members of Congress had never heard of it. The presidents Hoover served were briefed in general terms about domestic threats, but the detailed tactics, fake letters, forged documents, psychological pressure campaigns, rarely left FBI headquarters. Inside the building, the program was managed through a steady stream of memos. Agents proposed operations, a letter here, a rumor there, an idea for provoking a split in some local chapter. Supervisors approved or modified them. Files were opened, updated, and filed away in drawers behind locked doors. There was no adversarial court to hear from the people targeted, no defense counsel, no jury. Just officials reading each other's justifications and stamping them approved. The whole structure depended on two things: trust and fear. Trust in the sense that presidents, attorneys general, and much of the public assumed Hoover's Bureau was using its powers responsibly, within the bounds of law and necessity. Fear in the sense that the targets, and sometimes even their allies, suspected or knew that someone was watching but could rarely prove it. That combination insulated COINTELPRO from meaningful oversight for nearly 15 years. The long-term effects were not confined to the groups directly attacked. Within activist circles, the discovery that informants had been present at meetings, that letters or rumors had been fabricated by the government, left a residue of suspicion. Even years later, organizers wondered whether disagreements were genuine or seeded. Trust, once broken in that way, does not easily return. For communities already wary of federal power, Black neighborhoods, Native reservations, immigrant enclaves, COINTELPRO added another layer of skepticism. The FBI did not look like a neutral guardian of law. It looked like an instrument of political control. When the operations finally came to light in the 1970s, through leaks, court cases, and the Church Committee investigations, they also reshaped how many Americans viewed their own institutions. The revelation that a domestic intelligence program had targeted legal protest, that it had tried to destroy marriages, careers, and organizations without charges or trials, did more than tarnish Hoover's reputation. It chipped away at the assumption that federal agencies could be trusted to police themselves. It raised questions that still echo: who watches the watchers, and what happens when fear of ideology becomes a license to bypass the rules? COINTELPRO was, in many ways, the culmination of Hoover's entire approach to domestic intelligence. From the Red Scare raids of his youth to the files on presidents and pop stars, he had always favored information gathered in secret, stored in central files, and used as leverage. What COINTELPRO added was a systematic, bureaucratic machinery for turning that information into action, not in open court, but in the shadows. It was the point where monitoring crossed into manipulation as standard practice. In the quiet of those memos and typewritten directives, a certain idea of democracy, open conflict, public argument, transparent law, gave way to something else, a hidden struggle directed by a man no one had ever voted for, conducted largely beyond the reach of the people whose lives it altered. By the time COINTELPRO was running at full speed, the country around J. Edgar Hoover had changed almost beyond recognition from the world in which he'd first risen. He had entered Washington as a young clerk in the Woodrow Wilson era, when segregation was federal policy, women could not yet vote nationwide, and a small elite ran government with little outside challenge. He was still in command in the late 1960s, when young people filled streets, Black Americans demanded full equality, women questioned long-accepted roles, and television brought protest and police violence into living rooms every night. For Hoover, this was not a natural evolution, it was decay. He watched the civil rights movement he had tried to contain broaden into Black power, urban uprisings, and demands for community control of police. He saw student movements question the Vietnam War, the draft, university governance, and capitalism itself. He saw long hair, new music, new sexual norms, and a level of open criticism of authority that would have been unthinkable in the 1920s. His response was not to adapt, but to dig in. Inside the bureau, Hoover insisted that the basic assumptions of the 1930s still applied. Crime was individual and moral, not social or economic. Protest was suspect, a potential mask for subversion. Respectable citizens cooperated with law enforcement. People who questioned the Bureau's methods probably had something to hide. Newer ideas in criminology about poverty, discrimination, mental health, and structural factors left him unmoved. Rehabilitation programs, community policing experiments, or attempts to reduce incarceration for minor offenses were greeted with suspicion. Hoover preferred clear lines: lawbreakers and law-abiding, patriots and radicals, order and chaos. The political world he moved through, however, was less certain. Lyndon B. Johnson, who inherited the presidency after Kennedy's assassination and then won it in a landslide in 1964, saw Hoover as both an asset and a problem. On one hand, Johnson valued the Bureau's efficiency and its intelligence on domestic opponents. He leaned on Hoover's reports about civil rights organizations, anti-war activists, and political rivals. On the other hand, Johnson worried privately about Hoover's reach. He knew the director's files might contain material that could be embarrassing or damaging. He bristled at Hoover's habit of leaking, or allowing leaks, that served the Bureau's image. He occasionally spoke of replacing him, but he never did. Part of the reason was Johnson's political vulnerability. The Vietnam War was fracturing his coalition. Cities were erupting in unrest. Southern Democrats were peeling away over civil rights. In that atmosphere, firing the man most associated with law and order looked risky. Hoover's public reputation, burnished by decades of movies, radio dramas, and cooperative journalists, still presented him as the incorruptible defender of the nation. There was also a simpler calculation. Johnson, like presidents before him, could imagine the trouble Hoover might cause outside government more easily than he could imagine the trouble of keeping him inside. Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 on a promise to restore order, had a more natural affinity with Hoover's outlook. Nixon shared Hoover's belief that elites and the media were biased, that protesters were disloyal, and that a silent majority of Americans wanted firm control. He spoke privately of bums on campuses and saw the anti-war movement as not just mistaken, but dangerous. Hoover's reports on radicals and demonstrators fit neatly into his worldview. Yet even Nixon, who admired Hoover and courted his favor, understood that the FBI director was a power center in his own right. They had known each other for decades. Nixon had benefited from Hoover's quiet briefings during the 1950s, when communist accusations could make or break political careers. By the late 1960s, that relationship had hardened into mutual dependence. Nixon needed Hoover's cooperation. Hoover needed Nixon's protection to remain in office past traditional retirement age. Nixon signed an executive order exempting Hoover from mandatory retirement at 70. In theory, this recognized his indispensable service. In practice, it formalized something everyone already understood. Hoover would leave when Hoover chose, or when the political cost of keeping him became unbearable. Longevity by then was itself a form of armor. Hoover had served under 8 presidents. He knew where bodies were buried metaphorically and sometimes literally in old case files. He had watched administrations come and go, seen scandals rise and fade. He understood the weak points of institutions and individuals in a way few others did. Within Washington, this created a specific kind of caution. Attorneys general, Many of them much younger and serving for a few years at most, hesitated to confront the man who had been in charge of the bureau since before they finished school. Congressional committee chairs who might have wanted more oversight knew that Hoover had friends in their districts, files in his cabinets, and a network of allies in local law enforcement and the press. Removing him would not just be a personnel change. It would be a confrontation with the accumulated weight of decades of myth, loyalty, fear, and habit. At the same time, the society outside the Capitol was becoming less willing to defer automatically to that kind of authority. Televised images of police dogs in Birmingham, state troopers beating marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and soldiers in Vietnam raised questions about the use of official force. Young Americans who had grown up with the atomic bomb and McCarthyism were less inclined to accept secret lists and unnamed threats as sufficient justification for surveillance and repression. Reporters, especially in the late 1960s and early 1970s, began pushing harder. Magazines and newspapers ran pieces questioning the FBI's focus, its statistics, and its lack of transparency. Activists and lawyers filed lawsuits. Some judges asked what evidence justified domestic intelligence operations. Hoover felt that shift as an attack on his life's work. He lashed out in speeches and memos, warning that criticism of the Bureau played into the hands of enemies. He dismissed student protesters as spoiled, black militants as criminals, feminists and gay rights activists as part of a broader moral decline. The more the culture questioned old hierarchies, the more he clung to them. Inside the walls of FBI headquarters, though, he still commanded nearly unquestioned obedience. Promotions, assignments, and careers rose or fell on his favor. Young agents who grew up in a more fluid, questioning America entered a building where the director's portrait and rules had not moved in decades. There, the 1920s and 1930s lived on in office routines, dress codes, and internal slogans about loyalty and discipline, even as, beyond the doors, the world they were meant to police was changing in ways their aging chief could neither fully understand nor fully control. On the morning of May 2, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover did something he had never done before in nearly half a century at the top of American law enforcement. He failed to show up. Hoover died in his sleep at his Washington home, at age 77. The official cause was heart disease. For decades, people had speculated about how he might be removed, forced retirement, a political showdown, a scandal. In the end, his departure came in the quietest, most ordinary way. The political shock, however, was immediate. Richard Nixon, facing his own growing problems with leaks, protests, and a campaign season, understood that Hoover's death removed a powerful, if increasingly fragile, pillar of his administration. Within hours, Nixon named L. Patrick Gray, a loyal political ally at the Justice Department, as acting FBI director. The choice signaled something important. For the first time since 1924, the Bureau would be led by someone who had no deep roots in its culture, no decades of loyalty to Hoover, no long apprenticeship in its files and rituals. To many agents, it felt like an occupation by outsiders. Nixon may have seen that as an advantage. A director without Hoover's independent base of support would, in theory, be easier to control. But the timing proved unlucky for everyone involved. 2 months after Hoover's death, a group of burglars tied to Nixon's re-election campaign was arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The FBI, now under Gray, began investigating. The White House immediately tried to manage that investigation from the outside, and according to later testimony, sometimes from the inside. The old understanding that the Bureau answered first to Hoover and only then to presidents was gone. Attempts to steer the Watergate probe, to limit what agents could chase, and to bury leads would eventually help bring down not only Nixon's aides, but Nixon himself. Hoover's shadow still hung over all of it. Many in Washington asked a counterfactual question. Would Watergate have unfolded the same way if he had still been in charge? Some thought Hoover, with his sense of institutional self-preservation, might have resisted direct interference more effectively or used the scandal as leverage. Others suspected that his long practice of quiet political accommodations would have made him more, not less, willing to cut deals. What actually happened after his death was not a stable new arrangement, but a cascade of exposures. Within a year, something else shook public confidence in the intelligence world. In March 1971, months before Hoover died, activists had broken into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stolen documents. They mailed them to reporters. The files revealed extensive political surveillance, informants in legal organizations, and the label COINTELPRO stamped on instructions to disrupt lawful groups. Those documents, combined with growing reporting about CIA activities, army surveillance of civilians, and the secrets emerging from Watergate, created a sense that Hoover's style of hidden power was not unique. It was part of a larger system. By 1975, Congress could no longer treat domestic intelligence as something to be left to professionals behind closed doors. The Senate created the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. It became known simply as the Church Committee. For months, the committee gathered testimony and classified records from the FBI, CIA, NSA, and military agencies. Behind its calm name was a radical act, the first serious comprehensive attempt by elected officials to map the secret world Hoover had helped construct and operate for decades. What they found confirmed and deepened earlier glimpses. The committee documented COINTELPRO's campaigns against civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, socialists, feminists, and even some members of Congress. It traced how wiretaps, bugs, mail openings, and informants had been used, not just to investigate crime, but to shape politics. It exposed the FBI's harassment of Martin Luther King Jr., the pressure on critics, the labeling of dissent as subversion. Alongside this came revelations about CIA attempts to assassinate foreign leaders, NSA monitoring of Americans' communications, and military spying on domestic protest. The public mood, compared to the deferential 1950s, had changed. Many Americans were tired from Vietnam, shaken by Watergate, and less inclined to assume that secret state power automatically deserved trust. The image of Hoover as incorruptible guardian gave way to a more complicated figure. Efficient, yes, but also intrusive, manipulative, and largely unchecked. Out of that atmosphere came reforms. Congress created permanent intelligence committees in both the House and Senate to provide ongoing oversight of agencies that had once reported mostly to presidents and a small circle of insiders. Laws like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed in 1978, established special courts to review and approve certain kinds of national security wiretaps that Hoover's bureau had once arranged informally or secretly. Inside the Justice Department, guidelines were issued to limit domestic intelligence work. The FBI's ability to open investigations purely on the basis of political belief or association was formally restricted. Agents were supposed to have clearer predicates, articulable reasons tied to crime or foreign power connections, before collecting information. Another change went directly to the office Hoover had occupied for almost half a century. Congress and the executive branch moved to prevent another director from entrenching himself for life. A 10-year term limit for FBI directors was adopted. The idea was to balance continuity and independence against the danger of a single person accumulating Hoover-level influence across multiple presidencies. On paper, it was a sharp break with the past. In practice, some old patterns of power adapted rather than disappeared. Intelligence agencies remained secretive. Much of their work continued to be classified and shielded from public view. The new oversight committees often operated behind closed doors, their most serious debates hidden from the citizens in whose name they were conducted. The FISA court approved the overwhelming majority of surveillance requests brought before it, leading critics to describe it less as an adversarial check and more as a procedural formality. Domestic surveillance programs waxed and waned, sometimes curtailed after scandal, sometimes expanded in response to new perceived threats. The FBI still maintained files on individuals and groups. It still worked closely with presidents and attorneys general who valued information about opponents and movements. Formal guidelines could be revised. Definitions of subversive, terrorist, or extremist could stretch. In the years after Hoover's death, his name became a shorthand in these debates. Supporters of strong security measures sometimes invoked his era as one of order, clear lines, and effective policing. Critics pointed to his methods as a warning about what happens when fear and secrecy overwhelm constitutional limits. When people argued about mass surveillance in the early days of the internet, about data collection after the attacks of September 11, 2001, or about monitoring protest movements in the 21st century, they were often, whether they named him or not, arguing about the system he had helped pioneer. How much should the government know about private lives? Who decides what counts as a threat? How far can officials go in protecting the state before they erode the freedoms that justify the state in the first place? Hoover did not invent those questions, but he gave them a distinct American form, rooted in files, informants, and long memories. The reforms after his death tried to answer them with structures, committees, courts, term limits, guidelines, yet the tension he embodied between security and liberty, secrecy and accountability, remains unresolved. His career is over. His building bears his name. His methods echo in ongoing arguments over surveillance, policing, and protest. And the country still lives with the basic problem that his life's work made so clear. Once a government learns how to watch, it rarely volunteers to forget. J. Edgar Hoover did not stay in power for nearly 50 years by accident. Part of the answer lies in fear. From anarchists in the 1910s to communists in the 1950s to radicals in the 1960s, Hoover always had a threat to point to. Sometimes the danger was real. Sometimes it was exaggerated. But crises, or the sense of crisis, made his methods seem necessary. When people are afraid, they tend to tolerate a wide circle drawn around security. Another part is institutional expertise. He knew how to run an office. He built systems that worked on their own. Training schools, filing procedures, identification labs, standardized reports. Presidents came and went. Attorney generals shuffled. The FBI, as he shaped it, simply kept moving forward. That efficiency made him indispensable to the people above him, even when they disliked him. Secrecy helped. He controlled information, what the public saw, what Congress heard, what presidents learned, and what they suspected he might know about them. The private files, the rumors of files, the carefully leaked stories, all created a quiet leverage. Few wanted to find out what might surface in a dispute. Publicity completed the circle. The heroic image of G-men, the radio shows, the newsreels, the headlines about captured gangsters and thwarted spies, wrapped Hoover's bureau in a protective story. Criticizing him could be framed as criticizing law enforcement itself. He understood that reputation can be a kind of armor. And above all, he was useful to each president, from Coolidge to Nixon. He provided something: order during unrest, intelligence on rivals, a steady hand over a growing security apparatus. As long as he delivered, the cost of confronting him seemed higher than the cost of living with him. His career exposes a central paradox of modern democracy. Unelected experts can make institutions function smoothly. They can also accumulate power that drifts beyond meaningful oversight. Hoover's life sits exactly on that line between effective administration and authority that answers mostly to itself. The reforms after his death tried to draw the line more clearly: term limits, oversight, courts, yet the underlying question he leaves behind has no simple, permanent answer. In a system that relies on secret information and professional guardians, who truly watches the watchers? And how do citizens, often distant from the files and the briefings, know when necessary protection has quietly become something else?